we're discussing something that's couldn't be more important for our country, for our democracy, which is the smooth functioning of elections in a time of a pandemic, in kind of heated political discourse, in a time where we've seen efforts at foreign interference. We've seen marginalization of minority voters that, of course, stretches back quite a long time and continues. And we're going to address all of those topics and more. We have a rich set of expertise on the panel with 6 initial panelists. We have 3 or 4 additional panelists who provide some other perspective, who I will introduce midway through the next hour and a half. And then we also expect to have some time, probably not enough for every question, but some time to take questions via chat from the audience. And so just to clarify that, there will be, if you'd like to submit a question at any point, please use the Q&A feature of this Zoom chat, and my colleagues and I will make every effort to address it, or at least bundle some questions together if there's ones that feature the same topic. We are recording this webinar, and it'll be posted on the Penn Law website in the future. One little bit of housekeeping: some of you are taking this for CLE for an hour and a half, in order to do that, I guess to ensure that you're watching the whole thing, we're going to give you 3 separate passwords throughout the event. The first password is the word tennis, like the sport, apropos of the US Open going this week with no crowds in New York. And 2 other passcodes will be made available toward the middle and end of this session via my colleagues, I guess through the chat function. So we'll make sure that you get those CLE passwords. So on to the business at hand, and really on to the people who are more expert than me, which is our panelists. We've got 6 distinguished individuals in the initial panel. I'm going to start with kind of a lightning round with asking each one in turn to speak 60 seconds or less, kind of what issues are of concern about this election or about our system generally, and what should we and the audience be focused on. And we'll go, and then I'm going to circle back and ask them to speak at a bit more length. And we'll go in the order that they're going to speak in a few minutes. So first, former Senator Carey, a longtime senator from Colorado. Thank you for being with us. Would you unmute and let's see, we lost Senator. We'll come back to Senator Hart. Why don't we go to another guest from Colorado, which we didn't mean this to be a Colorado-focused panel, but we have so much expertise there. Our Penn Law alum, Jenna Griswold, who is the Secretary of State of Colorado. You're working hard every day on election security. 60 seconds or less. What should this group of law alumna and others be focused on about this election?
Well, thank you so much, Dean. It's so nice to be back at Penn Law. Wish I could rub the goat for some good luck. I would say the top line threats, I think the biggest threat is the president. He is lying about our elections and using tactics straight out of the Jim Crow South in a really despicable way. So whether it's attacks on the post office, attacks on vote by mail, threatening to send law enforcement to polling locations, we should all be really worried about that. We should also be worried that Congress has failed to act in a meaningful way to protect Americans' health in the voting process. And lastly, we should be worried about foreign threats. Specifically, disinformation is the number 1, and that ties into some of the lies about our elections. Number 2 are ransomware attacks. And number 3 are direct attacks on election systems.
Thank you. And we'll return to many of those issues, or all of those issues. Next, I'll turn to somebody who takes a kind of civil rights lawyer's perspective. Kristen Clark is president and executive director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and does a lot of important litigation, leads a team of lawyers around the country. Ms. Clark, maybe broadening it out beyond this election or this president, you're working on things that, of course, are very at issue this year, but have been at issue in the last cycle, will be at issue in the next cycle, and they involve fundamental access to democracy. So I'll come back to you in a few minutes for more, but distill down, what are the key issues from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Dean, for bringing us together and for having this conversation at the start of the school year. and creating this space for this important and timely discussion. The pandemic has upended life in every respect. It's upended how we work, how our, people are going to school, and it most certainly has upended our elections. And I think that the greatest error that we see are states that are acting like it's business as normal, business as usual when it comes to the way elections are conducted. So right now we're fighting states that are, doing things like mandating notary requirements for absentee ballots in order for them to count. We're fighting states like Texas and Tennessee where fear of COVID is not a basis to get access to absentee ballots. We're fighting states like Ohio that are limiting the number of ballot drop boxes that can give people opportunities to return their absentee ballots, and so much more. But I think that, there's one thing really looming heavy at this moment, and that's the crisis of police violence and racial violence that's gripped the country. And no doubt it is kind of the elephant in the room. We are gravely concerned about the very tense racial environment in the country right now and the potential impact that it can have on this election season.
Thank you, and I'll ask you to say more about what you and your lawyers are working on with respect to that in a few minutes. Representative Charlie Dent, a former Republican member of Congress from the Lehigh Valley area here in Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us, and again, quickly, and we'll return to you, but in a minute or so, what should we be concerned about with our election system this year and into the future?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. A few things. My biggest concern right now is a timely count or a timely tally of the votes. And I'm not suggesting there's voter fraud. I'm just simply saying because of the pandemic and so many more people will be voting by mail for the first time, I'm not sure that our systems are, given the problems at the post office, that we'll be able to have a timely count. In Pennsylvania, we went to no excuse absentee balloting for the voting for the first time in the primary, and it worked out reasonably well. But there were some slow counts in some areas, and again with light volume. So I'm worried that come November, that with mail-in voting and no excuse absentee balloting, that we are going to have a very slow count, and it could take weeks to get a count. And there are also, I think Axios has been using the term red mirage. That is, it appears that maybe more Trump voters will likely vote in person, and Democratic voters may be more inclined to vote by mail. And so you could have the illusion that maybe Trump is winning on election night or shortly thereafter, but in fact, not all the votes have been tallied, and we could have a different outcome, and that could further complicate what we're dealing with.
Thank you. Yeah, and in fact, in a few minutes, Secretary of State Griswold, I'll ask you to speak, like in Colorado, when are you allowed to start counting the mail-in votes? That's an issue in Pennsylvania with our state and federal law there. We have two professors with us, Professor Daniel Gillian from University of Pennsylvania, a professor of political science who studies elections and the rhetoric around elections and voting. Professor Gillian, do you, what should we be thinking about with this election and some of the themes that might transcend this particular year and that you've seen in your scholarship in our kind of the way in the US political system that you see manifesting this year?
Thank you, Dean Ruger, for bringing us together in this space. This is very informative, very helpful, and very appropriate during this particular time for us to talk about these important issues. For me, I think the greatest risk is misinformation. Misinformation about issues impacting America and the concerns, misinformation about what is being done and to address those issues. And then misinformation or lack rather of information on voting procedures and making sure that individuals' voices can be heard. And I think that this is indeed a historic year. And we don't know exactly what's going to take place, but we should try and minimize misinformation or address it as best as possible. So those are my concerns.
Great, thank you. And I'll ask you to speak more about where are Americans getting their information in this election cycle. I know you have a book on on this, and in our fragmented world, kind of the information flow is really important. Professor Josh Geltzer is a professor at Georgetown University Law Center and a constitutional lawyer. Again, briefly speak to some of the constitutional issues that you think will arise, and then I'm going to turn back to you with some of the questions that people have about how this might happen, if this ends up in constitutional litigation, what might happen. But what do you see as the parts of the Constitution or the Supreme Court precedents that might be implicated later this year?
And I just want to add my thanks, Dean, for the invitation to be part of this. Really honored to be with this wonderful group to discuss a topic, maybe the topic concerning many of us in this country right now. So there are various moments, fault lines, or at least potential fault lines, where relatively unused laws could come into play and at least could attempt to be exploited in dangerous ways. Let me just mention quickly a couple. There is a federal law that allows a state legislature to deem Election Day a failure and choose a new method of selecting the electors from that state. I think there's a lot of reason that the Constitution constrains the exercise of that, but to see hostile actors, bad actors, not in good faith attempt to exploit that law, that's one of those moments at the state level that I worry about. At the federal level, I worry about the role that usually happens unseen, unnoticed by most Americans when Congress comes together in joint session in January and performs what's usually a pretty rote task of certifying the Electoral College's results. But it doesn't have to be rote, at least conceivably. And again, I think there's a lot of law that can constrain this and put this back into channels where the right result gets reached. But I worry about those moments that are often quiet and unremarkable, becoming potentially fraught if actors not in good faith try to exploit them.
Thank you, and I think we want to we'll come back to you after some other panelists have talked with some of these constitutional questions. So I think with Senator Hart having some connectivity difficulties, I'll turn to another colleague from Colorado, Secretary of State Griswold, and ask you to speak for a few minutes about what the work you're doing in your state. I mean, let's start with something that Congressman Dent raised, which is, in a sense, if things happen exactly as they should, no evidence of improprieties or fraud, but yet we've got a bunch of ballots, an unprecedented amount of ballots coming in by mail. In that scenario, Secretary of State, when will people in Colorado, or by implication Pennsylvania, where we have a similar system, when will people know the tallies? We had a primary here in Pennsylvania where, with no suggestion of any substantial fraud, we still waited about a week to get the results. Is that what's going to happen? Are we not going to know the day after the election who wins the presidential election?
Well, I would say we never know the day after the election who actually wins, unless it's a landslide, because election results are never official on election night. And I do want to really caution this panel from repeating the ideas about voter fraud, because they are debunked. And I think as leaders, we really have to be careful. And don't take it from me. I could share all the stats from Colorado, but take it from the Conservative Heritage Foundation that found that over the last 20 years, the rate of fraud with mail ballots is 0.00006%. So for all you all on this call, the 330 people, that's 0.406%. And actually, vote by mail makes our elections a lot safer. Even President Trump's former DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen commended Colorado as a leader on election security. And one of the large factors is that Russia cannot hack a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to election night reporting, I think you're exactly right. And I was watching The Nation as those primaries were happening, because Colorado is considered the gold standard pre-pandemic, and even more so during the pandemic. And I've been working across the nation with other secretaries to try to share our election model. And I do think that states need to start tabulating mail ballots before election night.
Are you allowed to do that under Colorado law?
Absolutely. So we send out ballots about 3 weeks beforehand, and then tabulation starts 8 days before the election night. And that enabled us in our statewide primary, which, by the way, during a pandemic, we had a record turnout. We were able to report 89% of all the votes on election night. So mail ballots do take a little longer to process, especially when you have safeguards in place like signature verification. But it opens up access And I'm happy to talk about that, especially as it relates to some of the protests we're seeing and the recognition that we need to stop the systemic racism. It makes us more secure. And overall, it's the best way to vote during a pandemic, because we shouldn't be forcing Americans to risk their very lives to cast a ballot.
Mhm. Do you, I want you to speak more on that, but
Sure.
quick, my understanding, you would know better, is Pennsylvania and a number of other states by state law aren't allowed to start tabulating until election day. Is that, how big a problem is that? And would you urge such states to change our own state law to allow what Colorado does, the pre-election day tabulation?
Well, I would urge states to do it just because it makes the whole process go faster. In itself, it's not a problem. The problem is that the president is trying to create a situation where he can point towards various things to say the election was not fair to him. That's the problem. It's not based in reality, it's based in politics. So that's why, the fact that we've seen from these primaries, whether it's Milwaukee, there was 180 polling locations reduced to 5 to 6 hour long lines. Atlanta, 5 to 6 hour long lines. And it, not surprisingly, predominantly it was affecting Black Americans, because voter suppression is often systemic racism manifested. So the president's attacking, trying to force Americans into in-person voting, and then trying to threaten Americans going to in-person voting with threats of law enforcement. He's attacking the post office. He's attacking mail ballots. The alternative to returning a ballot through the post office is drop boxes. He's suing against drop boxes, including in Pennsylvania. So this is just one of the ways that the president is trying to rig the election in his favor, tilt it in his favor. And I would share with you, Dean, I don't think you were the dean when I was awarded the Penn Law International Human Rights Fellowship. And I went to work in Venezuela. And, the things we are seeing out of this president in the United States should send out alarm bells for everyone, Republicans, independents, and Democrats, because he is trying to tilt the election. And I know I don't have a lot of time, but I would want to share with everybody that in Colorado, more Republicans use mail ballots than Democrats. In the last 2 out of 3 elections, we had more Republicans use mail ballots. Even in our state primary on June 30th, we had a higher percentage of Republicans use mail ballots. So this attack on our elections is, the president says he's doing it because he thinks more Democrats will win if there's an expansion of mail ballots. But if you just look at the facts, which we should as attorneys, it's going to harm Republicans. It's going to harm independents. And, I don't think Americans should have to risk their very lives to exercise their constitutional right to vote. And that's what the president is trying to force people to do.
So thank you. One more,
Sure.
I'll ask you to elaborate on one other theme and then ask Kristen Clark to step in. You alluded to, mail ballots and that in Colorado, more Republicans than Democrats. So let's imagine a world where COVID is behind us. We'd all like to imagine that. Do you think mail ballots are the wave of the future? In other words, in a post-pandemic world in Colorado and around the country, would you favor us voting by mail, even where there's not the concrete health risk?
Absolutely. I think if you set up an election system that allows access, people will vote. Colorado has the highest percentage of eligible people registered to vote, and we always lead the nation in turnout. We're always number 1 or number 2. And it's not just mail ballots, it's online voter registration. If you can imagine, in 2020, a lot of states do not have online voter registration. It's just shocking. We have early voting. We'll have hundreds of early voting sites. I've increased our number of drop boxes by 49% since becoming Secretary of State. We're going to have at least 368 ballot return drop boxes across the state. And then we send a ballot to all registered voters. We increased our participation rate by 9% when we adopted mail ballot, evenly, by the way, among the parties. But when we're trying to come to grips with the systemic racism across this nation, mail ballots is part of the solution. We were able, when mail ballots were adopted in Colorado, we saw a 13% increase among Black voters and a 10% increase among Latino voters, a double-digit increase among blue collar, voters, and a 16% increase among young people. So if you provide access, people will vote. This is the wave of the future. We've already expanded across the nation mail ballots in a huge way. So in 2016, about a quarter of Americans had access. The Washington Post is estimating that 89% of Americans will have access in 2020 in the November's election. So I do think that the future is here. We have to fine tune things like we saw in Pennsylvania. Don't send out ballots so close to the election day by mail. Make sure you're starting to process. In Colorado, we're here and we want to work with everybody to make sure the elections go as smoothly as possible.
All right. Well, thank you. And I know you have to leave the panel soon, so I appreciate your joining us. You've got a busy role these days with the election impending. So another person who's doing active work in this election cycle, leading a team of top lawyers, Kristen Clark, who's the president of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Would you, Kristen, expand on what Jenna said about access issues, and again, maybe beyond this presidential election? I know you work on a lot of state elections. What are some of the imperatives that your group is fighting for? Do you also think that paper ballots are the wave of the future? And then, what else should we know about the litigation that your group is doing?
Yeah. Well, first, let me acknowledge that Colorado is kind of a gold standard, and really great work happening there to provide lots of meaningful access to voters. From where I sit as a civil rights attorney that focuses on some of the unique problems, burdens, and barriers faced by Black voters and voters of color, we really fight to ensure that there are as many avenues as possible open to voters. The reality is that in some parts of our country, the experience of voting in person deeply matters, particularly to Black voters who can recall the history of voter suppression efforts in the Jim Crow South. There are many Black voters for whom that experience of turning out in person and knowing that their ballot will count is deeply important. That said, voter education is critical this season because for many voters, they have no other option. They cannot compromise their health to go out and vote in person. And so robust voter education is really key to ensuring that first-time voters, first time in the sense that this is the first time they are navigating vote by mail, are able to do so successfully. There are lots of different steps, and it varies across the board in some states. In DC, my ballot had to go into the secrecy ballot that was sealed, and then it went into another ballot that gets mailed off. In other states, you need a notary. So voter education is really key. I'll also say that it's important to remember the unique needs faced by some of our minority language groups. So Utah is one state that went 100% vote by mail and neglected to think about the unique needs of Navajo-speaking voters, many of whom need oral assistance in order to cast a meaningful ballot. And so now in Utah, following our litigation, they have a mixed system that is largely vote by mail, but there are some in-person sites that give Navajo-speaking voters the opportunity to get that assistance that they need. This is an odd election season where we've got an agency that's really critical to all of this, the United States Postal Service, at the center of the discussion, an agency that is enshrined in the Constitution, an agency that has always been above the political fray, but an agency that is now deeply entangled in this question of whether or not we can get vote by mail right. There's a new Postmaster General in charge, Louis DeJoy, who comes to the role with virtually no experience inside the Postal Service. And he's really made some profound changes in a very short period of time. He's ripped up blue collection boxes from communities. He's banned overtime and put in place hiring freezes, barred postal workers from returning to post offices to ensure that every piece of mail gets delivered before the end of a day. He's banned scanning equipment to help process mail in mass. And so we've filed a lawsuit against the US Postal Service and Louis DeJoy with the hope that we can get remedial relief to correct the damage that's been done, but also to give the public the assurance that they need, that the Postal Service will do its job and get mail timely delivered back and forth this season. I guess the final thing that I'll note is that we've got work to do. This election season just makes clear what a complicated map of electoral changes we have across our 50 states. We need more uniform standards and best practices. We encourage the public to contact a hotline that we've run for the last 20 years. It's the Election Protection Hotline, 866 Our Vote. It's a nonpartisan hotline designed to help voters overcome a lot of these questions and problems and issues that sometimes come up when it comes to registering to vote and when it comes to voting in our country. Lastly, I'll just say we are thinking ahead to what lurks around the corner, and that's the 2020 round of redistricting. And this will be the first round of redistricting in decades where we are without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act, and a round of redistricting where we've got a new Supreme Court ruling on the books that essentially gives a green light to extreme partisan gerrymandering. So my hope is that once we catch our breath from this election season, we can start to turn our attention and full energy to gearing up to a upcoming round of redistricting that will no doubt be fraught with challenges and complexity.
Thank you. And your work certainly doesn't end with this election in November. And thank you for the work that you and your organization are doing and for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Congressman Dent, we've had a few things where I appreciate your perspective as a recent former Republican member of Congress, both with respect to the post office, this federal agency that has not heretofore been perceived as all that political or politicized. But I'd like to ask you first about kind of Congress's role in funding and oversight of the post office, both in general from when you were in Congress and what you're seeing now. And then maybe you could shift to Congress's role in a contested election and what often seems pro forma in January after the election, but from your experience, what might happen later this year. But could you tell us a bit about, what's going on with the post office? Did you participate in oversight of the post office when you were in Congress? And how do you interpret the dynamic between the House of Representatives and the Senate and the post office right now?
Sure. First on the post office, my first 2 years in Congress, I spent time on the Oversight Committee where we did have jurisdiction over the post office. And the post office, of course, has been, before the pandemic, before, what we're dealing with now with President Trump and his attacks on the Postal Service, we've had challenges with the post office. Obviously, since we've all gone electronic, we've gone digital, mail volumes have been down. United States Postal Service has struggled financially as a result of that reality. They've had challenges with unfunded liabilities, and been great debates about whether Congress should be injecting infusions of cash to help support the system. So the post office has had problems. So I want to be clear about that now. Now, again, Congress, I think, it has to be very nervous because these members of Congress are running for office too. Remember that they're running, just as are the presidential candidates. And as we get into this debate about mail-in voting, I would argue that I don't think that either party is particularly advantaged or disadvantaged by mail-in voting. In my state of Pennsylvania, I would argue that the Republican State Committee has been much more effective at getting absentee ballots out to voters, and they've been very effective at it for years. Democrats do it too. I think they're pretty good. But Republicans were particularly proud of how they would get people to vote absentee, and like clockwork, they would send out those applications, and voters would have them. So, and the other thing too that I think one of the previous speakers referred to that it seems because of President Trump's rhetoric, he is saying there's something wrong. The mail's bad. There's fraud with mail-in balloting, which there really isn't. There's greater potential for fraud there, but there isn't a big problem with it. He's scaring people. Now, at the same time, I think Republican voters in many cases are just as inclined to vote by mail, but he's scaring his own voters away who would ordinarily vote by mail. That's a big mistake that he has made. Two, it might be counterintuitive, but I keep hearing that, that many minority voters in particular prefer the in-person voting to mail-in. I think they trust it better. And I happen to think that in-person voting is more secure. And I prefer it myself, and I've voted both ways, by mail and by and in person. So I want to be clear about that, that the, so even though the Democrats are pushing mail-in voting perhaps more, I know that many minority voters in particular might be a little bit more fearful of that process than has been publicly reported. I wanted to say too that these members of Congress, they want the system, they will want this system to work. What they are going to worry about too, I think what I would be worried about, take a state like California, where they have a mail-in system. It's a non-competitive state. Joe Biden's going to win California. There's no dispute about that. But in those competitive House districts in California, it often takes weeks, more than a month in some cases, to get an outcome or a result from a competitive district in California. We saw that in 2018. There are 4 or 5 seats. It took over a month to get some results. Okay, now let's take the California model. If that's the situation in some other states where you have a close statewide race, particularly in a swing state, I mean, that could create issues. So if I'm a member of Congress, I'm looking at that issue. One of your other speakers mentioned too, I think it was Jenna, mentioned the long lines. And, that's true. There are long lines, but from my perspective, in my own district, during presidential years, we had people waiting a few hours, and they tended to be in Republican areas where they had larger polling places. So it's not just in minority districts. It happens in a lot of areas where you have long lines, and that's why mail-in voting is important, to try to help cut down on those lines. And so hopefully there'll be fewer and longer lines because of COVID. People will vote by mail. Another issue that I think the members of Congress are going to be worried about, and I'm not sure what they can do about this, because remember, we don't have a national election in this country. We have 50 state elections. What's going to happen if a lot of these ballots, because of mail failure, that these ballots don't get to these county courthouses prior to the close of the polls on election day. Some states, they have to be, those ballots have to be in. And what if they're delayed? What if we get, a significant number of ballots showing up after election day? What happens? And I hope, and again, the Congress has a limited ability to affect this. This is up to the state legislatures. How do they want their voting systems to operate? What are they willing to allow? My own opinion is they should allow for tabulation prior to election day. They should have maybe some kind of a grace period. I'm not sure for how long after election day to count votes that may have not been postmarked timely. I'm not sure what that period of time should be. Maybe it's a week. I really don't know. But because we're dealing with a mail system that many people are now questioning, in large part because of the president's own criticisms, that we need to think very hard about that. So, but right now, I would have to say that if you're a member of Congress, you want the mail-in system to work. Neither party. You want it to work because you rely on them, especially in states like Florida and Utah and there are others. You want this to work. Notwithstanding the president's comments, which frankly have been very counterproductive and harmful to not only his election efforts, but to many of the people down ballot who are also happen to be Republican.
Do you? Let me jump. We've gotten some good questions from the audience about kind of concrete things that audience members can do, and we've got some links. The ABA, the American Bar Association, for instance, has a clearinghouse that we're going to send you, and Kristen Clark's organization, the Lawyers Committee, for people who want to personally get involved. I mean, I'll editorialize one thing. I think it's a bipartisan reform. You mentioned it, that's a problem in PA law, is that ballots that come in completely normally, regularly, no issues at all, by mail or absentee can't be counted until election day, which means that we have this delay, which kind of, I think, doesn't help the confidence in the results. And personally, I would like to see all of us change in states that don't allow counting before election day, just for that regularity. Can you, Congressman Dennis, is there anything you'd advocate that you think should happen either at the federal legislative level or the state level in terms of maybe after this election cycle on a bipartisan basis, where we could improve the functioning, whether it be of this, through either federal legislation or state legislation? Are there specific things you'd like to see proposed and passed?
Yeah, look, some of the suggestions I just made, I hope could be approved prior to this election. For example, allowing for the tabulation of the votes prior to election day. coming up with it. And I think because of this election, there will be legislation after the fact about ballots that come in after the close of the polls. That should be something that has to be considered by most states. I think there should be some grace period. It's probably not that many votes, but or that many ballots, but in a close election, as we know, every vote counts. So those are just two of the biggest recommendations I would make. We want to make sure that mail-in voting is secure. And I want to be clear, I don't think there is widespread fraud, but it is much easier to manipulate mail-in votes, I believe, than in-person votes. And I would argue, and Dean Ruger, you're in Philadelphia. I have a memory going back to the 90s when we actually did have some real fraud in the city of Philadelphia in a special election for the state Senate, where the Republican candidate won the election at the polls by 500 votes, but lost the absentee ballots by, I think it was 20-1. And then they investigated, Pulitzer Prizes were won, and the federal judge threw out all of the absentee ballots because people were voted who did not know they were voted, and then unseated the Democrat who was able to win through the absentee ballot process. My point is,
I'm shocked to hear that about Philadelphia.
I know it can be manipulated, and that was a horrible case. It was in 1994, Marks versus Stinson. You go look it up, but the point I guess I'm making that they can be manipulated, and they should always try to find ways to make sure those are secure. And again, I don't think there's a lot of fraud, but when it happens, you have to be able to address it.
Great, thank you. Professor Gillian, if you could kind of intercede from an academic perspective, looking on a little bit more longitudinal, and I'm particularly interested your recent book, Governing with Words, with Cambridge University Press, about the political dialogue on race, public policy, and inequality. So I think we would all agree we have no shortage of words flying around from disparate sources. How does that inflect with some of these issues we're talking about legitimacy, access, all of the communications that people are hearing, and are people getting, I want to go back to something, for all of the words flying around, are people still lacking basic information?
Thanks. Yeah, the information, I want to start there, is going to be really important this year, especially for marginalized groups. I mean, historically, looking at African Americans and Latinos, we know that there is voter suppression taking place, and minority disenfranchisement. For example, 10% of African Americans and 11% of Hispanics have been told, or at least they reported, that when they went to the polls, they were informed incorrectly that their names were not on the rolls. This is relative to only 5% of white Americans. If we look at another survey, we find that around 14 to 15% of African Americans and Hispanics have indicated that they had trouble finding polls relative to only 5% of white Americans. So in this particular pandemic, we know that disparity is going to be even more exacerbated. So we have to do a good job of conveying information. Now, about those words, that's a really interesting dynamic this time around. Actually, the group of words I want to focus in on are law and order, because that is what we have seen in this particular time period. For sure, the elephant in the room, thing that goes bump in the night in the election room, I should say, is protests and protest activities and the unrest, and how individuals see that. And so we see President Trump talking about these issues in a way that takes play directly from Nixon's playbook, the law and order rhetoric that we saw in the early 1970s, and even going along with that silent majority strategy. Now, the silent majority discussions is something that was introduced to us in the late 1960s by Nixon, but even Trump put forth this rhetoric in his first run for office in 2016. You had even campaign signs created. Amazon, you could buy a sign that says the silent majority stands with Trump. And so this rhetoric now with law and order has been amplified in a way that is taking advantage of the polarization on race that's seen in America. And that's what we really have. We have really two Americas that's looking at race issues. And in some ways, you see individuals who view the protests, view the unrest, view nothing but violence, fires, and they're fearful and they don't see the issues. And then others who see several disgruntled individuals who are engaging in bad behavior, which should stop, but you have the vast majority of individuals putting forth honest, passionate claims about racial injustice in America. At the end of the day, that will likely influence the way that individuals vote. And when they start to think about racial issues, start to think about activities with protests, it's going to play a role. Just real quickly, historically, we've seen that when protest takes place in America around race, it has the ability to raise that issue, to make it more salient. And we see it becoming an important issue. That leads to greater mobilization in the minority community. We see greater fundraising and greater campaign contributions going into the pockets of those individuals that are willing to support protesters. And we see greater votes being gathered by those individuals who also support protest activity, or at least support the issue. And so as we look ahead to 2020, there's a great deal of uncertainty, but one thing we can be assured about is that the issue of race will be on individuals' mind.
Yeah, thank you. What about, I can't imagine, with every year, or certainly with every 4-year period, we're in a world where people in this country are getting their information from more disparate sources. Perhaps people seek out sources that align with their. What do you project, Professor Gillian, if we're in a world where, let's say there's a close election, even a contested election, we're in the first or second week in November, and Americans are hearing different things. Americans are getting their analysis of that election from very different sources. What, is that, how do you see that playing out? And is that an additional problem you've studied about information dynamics?
It's really a problem of countervailing forces. For sure, individuals will stay in their own pockets. If you're someone that looks at Fox News and you're going to go to that source, or if you're someone that looks at CNN, MSNBC, you're going to go to that source. But that's the sort of the negative aspects, is that you won't be able to go outside your bubble, because individuals have become so polarized that they listen to the same things that buttress their own preferences and their own viewpoints. However, the positive aspect comes from, and this is ironic, but I'm gonna say this, is social media, the ability to inform individuals. This is something that takes place with social movements as well, is that individuals are better able to disseminate information and spread information throughout networks whenever there's an injustice or something like that that takes place. And the same thing could potentially occur after the elections, as individuals are becoming more informed. You have to guard against disinformation, but the information will be out there in various formats. And to some extent, that's a positive thing.
Thank you. Last question, just more empirically. As the law dean, I see our law students are very engaged in this election, but that's clearly a selection bias with law students are going to be engaged in the election. You teach undergrads, obviously. I guess you're maybe just starting teaching next week, but yeah. The kind of 18 to 21 demographic, do your students seem, you feel that they're unusually engaged, or are they disillusioned in this election cycle? What do you get from the kind of undergraduate students, to the extent you've been talking with them?
Not only that, but I'm also a director of a college house here at Rhoden. And so I'm interacting with individuals virtually and in person. I'll tell you that students are really engaged. I just had my class yesterday called Race and Ethnic Politics, and the questions kept on coming. And it was hard. I felt bad about ending the Zoom session. So I believe that this generation is really motivated. They're really mobilized. They're really informed, or trying to seek out information, but they also just want to talk about it. I think that we're seeing a very energetic generation right here between the age group of 18 to 25, and that might translate into various outcomes at the polls, especially, at least I want to say, on the issues of race. Though that generation is very much engaged and they're reconsidering how they've seen race in the past and being more willing to understand that racial bias exists in America and thinking of ways that they can overcome it and push back against it. And that's a very positive thing.
Thank you. That's, and we'll see, we may follow up with that, but that's important, and thank you for sharing that. Well, we had Senator Hart and then we lost him. So we'll go to Professor Geltzer. Let's maybe, there's a lot you could speak to currently, but let's project forward a few months. And I want to ask you a few questions about the role of the courts. To what extent you imagine the judiciary getting involved, be it the lower courts or all the way up to the Supreme Court. If there's a contested election, particularly one that maybe has debates over the states choosing their electors, or that ends up in Congress. I'll ask kind of the law professor's question. Is this one that the Supreme Court might say is non-justiciable? Do you see them sitting on the sidelines in a contested election? Or do you see them intervening as they did in Bush versus Gore? And of course, so what kind of scenarios might we see? What should we as lawyers be looking at in the litigation that almost certainly will be coming after this election, no matter who wins or loses?
Not only might it be coming, it's already here. There are over 200 election and campaign related lawsuits percolating in state and federal courts across the United States today. And that's on
from both Republican and Democrats, correct?
Republican, Democrats, federal office and other office. That's where we are on September 2. And we're just getting started. But I also want to emphasize that litigation, things being resolved in the courts, that's okay. That's where we want these issues resolved. And in some ways, that's where the legal questions intersect with the disinformation that Professor Gillian and others have spoken to. And it may be worth just remembering a few data points in the recent history of Donald Trump, if you'll indulge me, Dean, just those 3 moments to remember. The only notable political loss of Donald Trump's short-lived career was when he lost the Iowa caucus to Ted Cruz. Within 48 hours, Donald Trump said he thought it was illegitimate and they should do it again. Now, that quickly became just a footnote in history because he went on to win overall the nomination, of course. But that's a hint of what happens when Donald Trump loses. Now, there is law. There's law in Iowa. There's law in all 50 states about what it means to have a recount, a recaucus in that case. There's a certain threshold, there's a certain showing, but that's not where Donald Trump tends to operate, or when he does, it's for show in the courts. So this is, and I saw the excellent question by one of the viewers and listeners here, what can people do? Inoculating friends and family against disinformation. That a mere claim of illegitimacy by one candidate is not a showing that there's anything to distrust or reject about an election result. If people want to go to court and make their case, judges can resolve that. But that's where handling these things in court, rather than spreading disinformation about illegitimate results, is critical. Let me just offer a couple other moments. Fast forward on the way to the 2018 midterms. And among all of Donald Trump's tweets, one of the strangest, and I know I'm setting the bar pretty high by saying that, but one of the strangest was when he indicated that the Russians were likely helping the Democrats to win midterm elections in 2018 because Trump said he'd been so tough on Russia. Now, nobody said that. The intelligence community didn't say that. Law enforcement didn't say that. The media didn't say that. But it seemed to make sense only if one thought that Trump wanted to cast doubt on the legitimacy of results, if they turned out to be bad for him or really for the Republicans. He wasn't on the ballot himself. Again, we have a constitutional structure that can channel that sort of claim. We have oversight committees, intelligence oversight, judiciary committees that do oversight of federal law enforcement. They can have witnesses come and testify as to whether this stuff is junk, disinformation, lies, or whether there's anything real there. That's where we need to channel this conversation into legitimate judicial and legislative oversight structures. One more example. We got to the 2018 midterms, and on election night, things looked pretty good for 2 candidates in Florida, the gubernatorial candidate and the Republican Senate candidate, 2 Republicans who had a pretty good lead on election night with mail-in ballots and other ballots yet to be counted still. And Donald Trump tweeted, I say we got to go with the election night results. Don't know where these other ballots showed up from, but that's not how we do things. We stay with the election night results. Well, that's not the law. That's not right. In fact, there is no such thing, as you heard from the Secretary of State of Colorado, as election night results. There are results when the votes are done being counted. And again, we have legal mechanisms. There's no law behind that sort of statement by Donald Trump. And so my point is this: we will see courts undoubtedly involved in this. But in some ways, when I see a court involved, that means we're channeling law and the peaceful resolution of election disputes rather than having it be a contest among falsities spread on social media, and even worse, citizens feeling they should take matters into their own hands in the form of private militia groups, which we could talk about as well.
So I'm going to ask you a question in somewhat of a mischievous way, is that about a chief executive exercising their authority to delay an election on public health grounds. And I say what I want to say, one of the most popular chief executives in the world, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, just did that last week, okay? And had a different reception than when Donald Trump tweeted about it. And so why is it wrong to think about, in a public health crisis, delaying an election? And how should it go down? We've had some questions about emergency authority. If indeed the pandemic worsened, et cetera, would there be a constitutional way to delay the election? Who does it? And is it the president's choice alone under our system, or is it something else?
It is not the president's choice alone here in the United States. And in a few moments, when I get an opportunity, I'd like to circulate on the chat a short paper that was produced by a group called the National Task Force on Election Crises. I have the pleasure of serving on that task force. So does my friend Kristen Clark, who joined us for a while before and who does such important work in this space. And she and I and others have worked to put out these sorts of papers to answer precisely this sort of question, because the law does give us clear answers. And in our system, it would take changing federal law, changing a federal statute to change election day. And that's why you saw such strong pushback when Jared Kushner and others suggested that somehow the president could do this alone.
Yeah, thank you. Senator Hart, thank you for joining us and surmounting some of the connection difficulties. I'd invite you to speak with your long and distinguished career. What sense do you have about the risks of this election that may be different from others that you've been involved in? What has changed in our country? If you don't mind unmuting yourself, and I'd invite you to just speak from your wisdom and experience about what are you concerned about? Why are you involved in kind of thinking about this election season? And thank you for joining us.
Well, Dean, first of all, profound apologies for the technological complications. I'm tempted, and I apologize to fellow panelists also, I'm tempted to give out the phone number of my internet service provider to all of you, but we'll do that after the conference. Very briefly, in connection with the election itself, my principal concern, and I think others ought to be concerned, is with the newly discovered secret presidential emergency powers in the dozens that are very mysterious, and even those who claim or who should know about them either say they've never heard of them or refuse to answer. All it takes is for a president to declare a national emergency, and this president has declared 7 national emergencies already. And all of these powers, as he has said in various occasions previously, are at his disposal. Presumably, or reportedly, if you add them up, they amount to suspension of the Constitution of the United States and represent a blueprint for dictatorship. Beyond the election, as if that's not enough, the 2 deep concerns, depending on how the election comes out, are first of all the exacerbation of culture wars already begun, particularly on racial lines. And that can get worse and divide this country.
All right, we have, it looks like we have frozen up. Let me, by the way, okay, so quick interlude on the, some of you have posted about the CLE passwords. And the second one is called Daisy, as in the flower, D-A-I-S-Y. Okay. Let me, I think this is a good time if I could ask my colleagues to bring in Elizabeth Preet-Havey, maybe Congressman Gephardt if he's available, and we'll continue to have Senator Hart continue to speak when he can join us again. But I wanted to bring in, we have a few other guests who are going to add to the conversation. Osagi Yamasogi is already on. Let me ask, as soon as we get Liz Preet-Havey on, welcome, Liz. Thank you for joining us. And I asked you to join in part, and you kind of reached out, and we wanted to get your perspective as a current chairperson, Republican chairman of Montgomery County, somebody who I suspect shares some of the concerns expressed, but on others has a different perspective, particularly about our current president. And just would ask you both, I guess, to speak to both of those sides. You know, what would you like the audience to hear from your perspective as a distinguished Penn Law alum who's been deeply involved in Republican leadership in Pennsylvania and still is, and a lawyer partner at Dilworth Paxson. And then, are there things that you think we could work together on going forward about some of these issues of tabulating the ballots under state law or federal law? And so if you could share your thoughts on both of those aspects, we'd appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Dean. Congressman Dent really hit the nail on the head. We all want this to work. But my experience of what happened in Montgomery County, this primary, was really shockingly bad. My team, as from the MCRC, did a 30-page report, which we detailed as many of the complaints as we could in writing. We broke them into categories. We supplied them to the state legislature. We also supplied them to the Democrats who run Montgomery County. We have a good relationship with them, and they thanked us for it because it provided a lot of details of the breakdowns across the whole process. Literally, the mail-in ballot process broke down from beginning to end at every single level. Some of it was in the news, 10,000 ballots had the wrong instructions on them. According to the numbers that were provided by the Democratic commissioners, they said it was 10,000 ballots that were incorrect instructions. They said about 2,000 ballots were mailed to the wrong people. I still don't know who those 2,000 ballots are, but we had hundreds of complaints from people, people who were, got Democrat ballots, then never could get a phone call back. There was basically no way to make sure either that your vote was counted unless you went on election day to the polls to see if your name was on the list. That's the only way that guaranteed that you could see if your vote was counted. Another critical problem that we had was we were not given an opportunity to check the absentee ballots. That's completely against the election code. So all of the ballots were already checked by the Democratic operation. And then we were allowed to watch them be scanned, but there was no Republican who could check the outside envelope to see if the person who voted was actually a registered voter, which is the opposite of what happens with absentee ballots, where all the
is that a problem? Is that a problem in Pennsylvania law, or was it? To me, that sounds.
No, I think it was just Montgomery County just was overwhelmed with the ballots, and they didn't let us do it. And we didn't realize that happened until election day when we went to check the ballots and were told, sorry, there's no time, you can't do it. So that has to be changed. We also have witnesses who watched multiple ballots being dropped into the drop boxes. There has to be security there that's actually going to be making sure we're not dropping, there's no ballot harvesting. On election day, most of the Republican heavy areas ran out of ballots. The Democrat areas didn't run out of ballots. All of the Republican provisional ballots look different than the Democratic provisional ballots. The Democratic provisional ballots looked like very similar to what was being scanned. They were white. The Republicans were often green, and they all had printed in big letters across the word sample. So when we are flooded with complaints saying, I can't get a call back, I applied for a ballot, I got a Democrat ballot, not a Republican ballot. I applied 6 weeks ago, I never got a response. Then you have those people that actually go to the polls to say, I'm going to vote provisionally because I don't know if my mail-in ballot was counted. They see that the provisional ballots look different, that they have the word sample on them, or there's actually no Republican ballots. And so the county is literally running thousands of ballots to the western part of the county. I'm not alleging that there was fraud, but I am alleging that there was such a tremendous breakdown that the election and the primary wasn't fair. We didn't have any big primary battles, so it wasn't the end of the world, but it has to be a better system in the general election.
Do you think
they cannot get a phone call back? You know, the way we have to deal with this is I actually have to go to the county commissioner who runs the voter services because my executive director can't get answers. So we requested, for example, for this general election, we requested a list of the people who applied vote by mail. We have reports that there are Democratic committee people who are knocking on doors saying, you're not on our list as having voted by mail. They were provided by somebody with that information. We requested the information and were told we have to wait several weeks. I went directly to the RNC. They said they've been denied the information from the Department of State. Somehow, you know, again, I'm not alleging fraud, but I do feel like the system is not ready for prime time for this election. And there were enough disenfranchised voters in the primary that, and quite frankly, there are a lot of Democrats. I have a friend who's a Democrat, who's a big public Biden supporter, who said there's no way in heck he's not voting in person because of the disaster he experienced in the primary. So I do think there has to be a discussion about the fact that it's not all like Colorado where things work well. You know, experts will say it takes several elections for mail-in ballots to actually work without, you know, smoothly. Our scanners didn't work, you know, tremendous issues.
And by the way, you have I think we're posting a link to the report that you allude to, and I appreciate that. Are you, let's look quickly, because I think we have a couple other, Senator Hart is back on by phone, but do you have, would you in principle oppose in 2024 and widespread voting by mail, assuming Pennsylvania can fix the detailed issues you address? In other words, are you objecting to the implementation or to the very fact of mail?
No, I'm objecting to the implementation. If this can be done fairly, and that's where I take issue with Jenna Griswold's comments, to say this has been completely debunked and shut down the conversation is very frustrating to me because I'm on the receiving end of hundreds and hundreds of complaints. And what happened here is you have the president saying mail-in ballots are fraudulent. And then we have all of these people who had these significant issues, and it festers and it creates a huge problem and disenfranchisement of Republican voters.
Yeah. So
I mean, that's where we are today.
So, you know, we're in this election cycle, but I'm encouraged and I look forward, you know, that it may be something in Pennsylvania here we can work together on toward updating our system after this election. Senator Hart, can you hear me? I see you were in the middle of sharing your experience and kind of leading to this election. If you can hear me and can unmute, why don't you finish your thoughts? We'd love to hear them. Looks like you're muted still. All right, let me turn to somebody who I really, Congressman Gephardt or Speaker Gephardt, nice to see you. I should say what I personally really want to ask you about is the Cardinals scoring 16 runs yesterday. I'm a native St. Louisan from Kirkwood, maybe the second biggest Cardinal fan on the call behind you, but let's not talk about that. Let's, you know, as a leader of Congress.
Let me remind you that Stan Musial was from Denora, Pennsylvania.
That's true. There we go.
All-time hero.
Connection. So with that aside, just welcome. And again, you know, you heard Congressman Dent talking about the role of Congress. Did you, in your role as Speaker or in your long career in Congress, did you participate? You know, were there issues that came up about contested electors, elections, and how do you see this playing out with respect to congressional leadership or any other thoughts you want to share.
Well, if you delve into the problems that could be created if this dispute over who can be an elector goes from states to the Electoral College to the Congress, you can see a recipe for having both the House and the Senate deeply involved in unwinding these issues. Let's say Pennsylvania, the legislature decides to send in their own slate, and then the governor sends in his own slate. Then the Congress has to figure it out. So you can really come up with some wild scenarios that involve the Congress. But in my few minutes here, let me kind of pull us up to 50,000 feet and talk to all of you about the importance of this election. I'm old. I've seen a lot of elections. I've never seen a situation where I'm as worried about having a valid, successful election. And there are really two reasons for that if you look at it from 50,000 feet. Number one, we have a pandemic, so it's a lot harder for a lot of people to vote or to go through the process of voting in a new way. But secondly, our society, our country is as polarized and divided as any time, maybe since the Civil War. It's really a serious, serious problem. And if you really look at that, the hallmark of any democracy is to have a valid, successful election, a peaceful transition of power, and then that both sides accept the results of the election. And that is critical. I was leader in the House for 14 years. I saw lots of big, controversial, difficult, bitterly contested votes. But I was always so impressed that after the vote was taken, the losing side, and when I say losing side, I mean the people out in the country that really cared about this issue, were willing to accept the results because they thought the process was fair. They were heard, they had a vote, and the votes were counted successfully. That's what we have to do this time. It's very simple and straightforward. So I want to congratulate you and everybody on this call for addressing these issues, thinking about them ahead of time before we're in a national crisis. And I'll finally say, you're the right ones to do this because Pennsylvania, as I look at the electoral map, is going to be the epicenter of this problem if we have problems come November the 3rd and thereafter. So thank you for doing this. You ought to keep doing it. There ought to be more seminars like this in Pennsylvania and elsewhere so that we have a chance to bring off a valid, successful election in this country.
Thank you, Congressman. And I should say, I think we've put some links up to various reports. We've also put up some ABA information, I think, they're specifically asking lawyers to play a role in on election day in monitoring the polls and things like that. I want to invite a good friend of mine and of the law school, Osagie Masogi, who is the incoming chair of our board at the law school and has helped me think about these issues this summer and was instrumental in bringing this event together. And thank you, Osagie. And indeed, a perspective you could bring just from your own background, growing up in Nigeria and working in Europe and Africa, as well as here, is kind of almost the comparative dimension. You know, there's, of course, you've lived in various democracies and seen issues that arise with elections, and some of the things that you've shared with me have been notable, and I appreciate you sharing it with the group about your concerns about this election in light of what you've seen through your life in some other countries.
Thank you very much, Ted, and thanks to everyone who has participated in this seminar. You know, from my perspective, the real focus ought to be on the Constitution and the right and the ability of all eligible Americans to be active participants in the electoral process. By definition, this is not a partisan issue, as access to the polls should be for all eligible Americans, irrespective of their political party affiliations or who they choose to vote for. That's what is paramount in my thinking, because it's a structural issue. Everyone should be able to participate in an election, as Congressman Gephardt just talked about. I have lived in countries where the only way the government in power could stay in power was to prevent a large percentage of its citizens from voting. That's not a theoretical issue. That's a factual issue. I mean, if you want to have the patina of democracy, then the center of the epicenter of how you control that is access to voting. And I've lived in countries where that is what the government has done to prevent its citizens from voting. And unfortunately, that has, in many countries, led to political instability, has led to violence, has in some instances led to death. We can see what is happening in Belarus right now. So it's not a theoretical discussion about what is the consequence when you prevent a large portion of your citizenry to vote. In our country here, we've gone through significant upheaval in terms of the right to vote for different segments of our citizenry, from the issue of women to the issue of people of color having the right to vote. So it's not a theoretical issue. If you want to affect a democratic system, then controlling access to voting becomes important. One of the things that strikes me, and this is just a perspective based on different experiences, is that so many of us in the States are of the view that everything I just talked about happens over there, and there is not here. That this could not happen in America. You know, this is America. Unfortunately, that is simply not true. There have been really stable democracies who historically have lost their democracy. It has happened in a number of countries. And it's interesting, if you look historically as to what is the first step in the citizenry losing their democracy, it tends to be the question of voting. The minute you can compromise the basic building blocks of that democratic construct, where the will of the people are expressed through the ballot box, the minute you compromise that sufficiently, then you start the process of people losing their republic. I remember the story that has been said so many times about the founder of our university, of Penn, Benjamin Franklin. And the story that is told, I don't know how true it is, because I'm always wondering who was there. But there's this wonderful story of him, of the deliberations in Philadelphia ended in 1787, and Mr. Franklin going back home, and a lady asking him what was the outcome of the deliberations, and do we have a republic? And we all know the answer to that. He ostensibly said, yes, we do. But what was more important is the last phrase, if we can keep it. So democracies get compromised if we attack the building blocks of voting, and we can lose it. Even in 1787, this amazing experiment that we call America, Franklin acknowledged that it could be lost if we, the citizenry, did not pay attention to it. And it's fascinating when you think about what someone like Edmund Burke also said about really, really bad things happen if people of goodwill do nothing about it. So to those who have been asking, what can we do? I'm very pleased that there have been a number of pieces of information that has been provided during this seminar about things that people can do. This is a participatory democracy. and we need to participate, every single one of us. We cannot sit on our posteriors and talk about others. And I think that is a fascinating part. So I encourage everyone to be active.
Thank you, Osagie. And I'm going to turn back to Senator Hart one more time. I've noticed some chats, again, both from the Republican side and the Democratic side. We need poll workers. Having poll workers of both parties is the best way to achieve legitimacy. So whatever your perspective, please do try to come out on election day. Senator Hart, welcome back. You were in the middle of an important statement about your concerns, your deep concerns. So please finish your thoughts, and we appreciate you working so hard to reconnect with us.
Apologies once again. What I was trying to get across after the election, depending on how it goes, is whether or not this country will return to an internationalist democratic alliance foreign policy, or whether we will continue down the current path of nationalism and populism together with countries in Eastern Europe. But let me repeat before technology overtakes me. Everyone should be concerned about these secret presidential powers. I don't mean to harp on it too much, but the press is not paying enough attention, and they should. They can be invoked simply by the president declaring a national emergency and then suspending much of the constitutional guarantees of liberty.
Thank you, Senator. And actually, that's I wanted to invite one other. So we've got another former senator from Colorado, Tim Wirth. Thank you for being here. We didn't intend to be so Colorado focused, but we've had the wisdom of it. Senator Wirth, you worked as a deputy secretary in the Nixon administration, and then you worked in the Clinton administration. And I guess I would ask you, so to this notion about emergency powers, I'm sure you noticed, as I did, when the president, or Jared Kushner floated ideas about changing the election, how many Republican leaders in Congress who on other issues have been quite aligned with the president spoke up. Are you comfortable with some of your former colleagues in the Senate, or that there would be a bipartisan pushback? Were there an effort to use some kind of executive authority?
Well, it's hard to know, not knowing more specifically who has access to these secret powers and how they would be implemented. The research done on this indicates that very few members of Congress currently, or even in the past, have even been aware that these powers existed, let alone approve them. There were, in the Cold War, in the Eisenhower years, presidential powers for succession of government. And those, many of them, had congressional approval, or at least authorization of budget expenditures to keep them alive. But then the Cold War ended, and the nuclear threat didn't go away, but it was greatly diminished. And yet these powers continued even in the 10-year gap before 9/11. So it's as if these secret powers have a life of their own that very, very few people understand or know about, including members of Congress and senior administration officials.
Okay, thank you. Senator Wirth, would you comment on that? Do you, should we, let me just, am I wrong to think that kind of a bipartisan group of members of Congress in the House and the Senate would resist kind of some secret assertion of power, given how anomalous that would be? And can you unmute? Senator? Okay, we still can't hear you. All right, I think, let me ask, we can't hear you, Senator. Can you unmute the? Oh, there it is.
There we go. Yeah, we don't really know what members of the Senate would do. They have been less willing to open up the process, and I think we have to just ask, why would we have a series of secret powers in a constitutional republic and nobody knows about them? I mean, that's certainly not any kind of a way in which to operate. We wouldn't do that for anything else, and we ought to at least have these opened up, as Senator Hart has recommended. We ought to have a commission to look at this. This is a serious issue that will occur in the new Congress. Just to pick up on what Osagie said very briefly about Franklin, the group that has helped to put this together, we call ourselves Keep Our Republic. Gary and Dick Gebhardt, Tom Ridge, and others involved in this. And this is terrific to do this seminar. We hope it will be repeated elsewhere around, not only in Pennsylvania, but around the country. And this is a reflection of what Franklin said. A republic, if we can keep it, we are determined to keep it. The goal is a completely fair, fully counted election. That's the way we transfer power in this country, is through the voices of the electors. And we have to insist upon that. That's not Republican, that's not Democratic. Our group is bipartisan in nature. The purpose is bipartisan. We all ought to be, as has been reflected here, focusing on this. I was, as surprised as probably all of you were to listen to, the description of Liz of all the problems in Montgomery County. But that was I wouldn't think ideological. I was just competence, and we have to insist on government competence as well. But anyway, thank you very much for doing this. We could have more discussion about the real mirage and the blue wave and what it means. I think you'll anticipate that's going to happen in Pennsylvania and a lot of other places. And maybe we can do a better job of illuminating what that means as well. But thanks a lot to the University of Pennsylvania and to you, Dean, for putting this all together.
All right, well, thank you. I guess we maybe have a few minutes left. I'm going to ask my administrative colleagues who did such a great job pulling this together on the CLE password. I think we have to do our legal compliance business. Let's see. What is the third? Is this the time for the third password? Third code is picture, as in picture frame, PICTURE. Again, if any of you are doing this for CLE and need help, ask us. Let's see. All right. Let me, I guess, Congressman Dent, we haven't heard from you in a while. I mean, do you want to kind of comment both on, I guess I may want to hear from you and maybe from Liz Preet-Havey as well about kind of, what do you think the Republican, Pennsylvania Republican response would be if there was something very anomalous like an emergency power declaration? Would that be, and you can each give your own answer, but is that something that would there be kind of a bipartisan response negatively to, or should we,
I would hope there would be a bipartisan negative response to that if it were to occur. I have not gamed out exactly what would happen in Pennsylvania, as Congressman Gephardt pointed out. If the governor, for example, offered a slate of electors different, and the legislature offered another one. I haven't thoroughly thought that through, but I guess what I'm concerned about in Pennsylvania, is system failure. As Liz pointed out correctly, there were problems in the state. And again, I don't think there was bad intent. I don't think there was fraud. It's just that we never did this before. No excuse absentee balloting. And there were problems. Again, it's a light turnout primary, no big races on the ballot that were affected. There were a few primaries that were, settled, weeks later, but there are concerns, and I think we shouldn't minimize them. Again, a reform, in terms of, and I do hope this legislature thinks hard about allowing for these votes to be tabulated timely, and allowing for a grace period after the election to receive ballots. That is going to be a big
jump in? Is that something that could actually happen before November? I mean, you think that could happen before this election?
I don't see why it couldn't. I mean, it doesn't. They won't need new machines. Just a matter of allowing them to count prior
You need
to
a state
the
law, right? I think
what's that?
Governor Wolf may have proposed that law. I think it's with the legislature.
Yeah, I mean, they should do it, immediately. And there's another little wrinkle to what Congressman Gephardt had said too, that, if there is some dispute after the election, this is what I worry about, and the legislature is quite close in terms of the composition, but it could conceivably happen that the legislature could flip from Republican to Democrat. And the session ends on November 30th in Pennsylvania. And so that time between December 1st and whenever the new slate of members of the General Assembly are sworn in January, well, this period of purgatory. I mean, who's in charge? Who's making decisions? The new guys aren't sworn in, and the old guys are technically done. I mean, that's another wrinkle that we have to think very hard about. And again, I just want to say something too about this in-person voting versus mail voting. Like, there are a lot of people out there who prefer to vote in person. I know I do. But because of the volumes that we're seeing at the polls pre-pandemic, the lines are very long in so many polling places, both Republican and Democratic areas. You have to accept that. And you need mail-in voting. We need mail-in voting, to mitigate that problem. Another reform they need in Pennsylvania too is that if you want bipartisan, judges of election and poll workers, you're going to have to allow, say in the city of Philadelphia, that there aren't a whole lot of Republicans down there. So you're going to have to let Republicans from other jurisdictions to sit in the poll as a poll watcher. And I know that's been resisted, I believe, by some of the Democrats. I think they have to relax that. And there are probably Democrats, there are probably Republican areas where there aren't a whole lot of Democrats who need to do the same thing. So these are some changes that need to occur, I think, quickly. And one of the challenges is that, we don't, like I said, we don't have a national election. We have 50 state elections and 50 states that set up their own systems, and there's no uniformity, and there are likely to be problems. And we simply don't know, we just don't, it's hard to anticipate every problem that we could envision. I'm only focusing on one state, but every one of these states potentially has their own issues to contend with. Hey, the states have been doing mail-in voting for a long time. They have this down. I'm not worried about them so much, except California.
Thank you. Liz, I know you had chatted, you texted that this problem, what can we lawyers do, and what can this law school do to make sure there's, Republicans going into that there's kind of a poll watcher from both parties? Is that something that we need more organization in Pennsylvania? And I certainly would want to help match our students and alumni of both parties to have them go where they are needed in the state. But is that a real thing
that's a huge problem? Yeah, it's a huge problem. We don't have enough Republicans to watch. And if we do use these mail-in drop boxes, we really need Republicans to stand and make sure that ballot harvesting isn't happening. Part of the issue here is people's confidence that the system works. And if they aren't confident, they will be disenfranchised. And so my argument to the Democrats in Montgomery County it's resonated with them, that they do want to make this a fair process. They don't want to be accused of fraud. So allowing Republicans to have people stand at these ballot boxes whenever they're placed, it'll be a couple weeks beforehand, to make sure that the rules are followed, having Republican poll workers quite frankly, in places where it's all Democrats all the time. I've worked on elections in the city of Philadelphia, and I take a lot of issue with Ms. Griswold's comments that there are not fraud. I witnessed it with my own.
Is there a converse problem? Is there an issue? Are there some counties in the middle of the state where there's a shortage of Democratic poll watchers?
I'm not sure about that. Interestingly, when I went to the legislature with my report, there were Republicans from the mid part of the state, the rural areas where there were not a lot of mail-in ballots, who didn't take the report seriously.
Yeah. Okay.
So, I don't know. I just think the Southeast counties are different than the rest of the state because of the number of people that apply and the number of polling places that need coverage. And all of those Southeast counties are run by Democrats. So that leads to already a concern by Republican voters.
Okay. We're pretty much at our time. Senator Hart, I would give you the last word, just because if you're connected and want to kind of send us out with what you would, what's important to think about over the next few months and beyond.
Well, I concur with what Tim Worth said. This is a test not only of the current political process, but a test of the ideal of the republic created by our founders. And if we can't do this right, if we are going to let one side or the other, president or non-president, manipulate the system, I know, having traveled as most of you have in other countries, how much people watch us because we've asked them to. We've held ourselves up for years as an ideal of democracy, and we're losing that. People are watching and observing and not liking what they're seeing. So we've got to get the country back on a track that at its best has always been on, with both parties getting along. I served in the Senate in the 1970s, and Democrats and Republicans got on fine. That was before the big polarization.
All right, well, that's I think a good note to end on, and for those of us gathered here as lawyers, alumni, students, faculty, and you know, I think we clearly have a role to play, you know, in expressing our views, but working together to ensure the effectiveness of this election and those in the future. And I appreciate all of the panelists for your views. We had, you know, it was we could have heard a lot more from all of you, but this hour and a half went really fast. I guess let me say that again, I got some CLE. The first word was tennis. The second word was daisy, like the flower. The third word was picture. And so again, to all of you who shared your views and to all of you who attended, thank you. This is really important for our country, and we will continue the discussion. And I look forward to working together with many of you. So thanks very much.
Nice job.